Hello, this is Paul with you. This is March, 6th, 2021. This is episode 7 as we address the biblical issue of the biblical role of men and women. And today I'm covering out of this book that we've been going through, objection number 2 that egalitarians have about men having a specific role distinct that of which is from women. So egalitarians are going to believe that the roles for men and women are the same, whereas I believe, and so do the authors here, that scripturally that is not the case. And again, this is not my idea. I'm not coming up with my agenda. I'm merely coming up with what I see is biblical. So, if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But if I'm right, and you don't agree with me, well, then you don't agree with God. So you can take that up with Him. So this objection, and I didn't start my timer. I should. I don't know that I'm going to be as exact as I have been in the past, because it just seems to be a hurry up and get through it in time. So I'll keep track of it, but let me just do my thing here. So the second objection that this author is addressing, and that would be Grudem, would be that mutual submission in Ephesians 5:21 nullifies male authority in marriage. So Ephesians 5:21 says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." So the egalitarians will say, "Aha! That proves that men and women have equal roles." Well, slow down here. And I'd like to read one little clip here from the author. He says that egalitarians say that this verse teaches mutual submission, quote unquote. And that means that just as wives have to submit to their husbands, so husbands have to submit to their wives. Doesn't the text say that we have to submit to one another? And this means there is no unique kind of submission that a wife owes to her husband, and no unique kind of authority that a husband has over his wife. Some egalitarians will say something like this: "Well, of course I believe that a wife or a wife should be subject to her husband, and a husband should also be subject to his wife." That's what an egalitarian is going to say or argue. Well, I don't believe that to be the case at all. I like what Daniel Doriani says, and out of the book here I'm extracting, it says Daniel Doriani has demonstrated that a number of earlier writings thought there was a kind of mutual submission, quote unquote, taught in the verse, but that such submission took very different forms for those in authority and for those under authority. And I think that's very important here, that submission, there is a mutual submission, but the submission takes very different forms for those in authority and for those under authority. They took it to mean that those in authority should govern wisely and with sacrificial concern for those under their authority. So, we also see in Hebrews, if I can pull up Hebrews 13:17, the writer of Hebrews says, "Obey your leaders and submit to their authority. They keep watch over you." So, Paul's not going to contradict himself, and he's not going to contradict other scriptural writings on this matter. So there needs to be a proper understanding of what Paul is saying when he says submit to one another. And we got into that with the first objection where we talked about Galatians 3:28, and that's in my previous YouTube video on this matter. So at any rate, if I could buzz to a comment that Barclay has. Well, I'm going to go to Ephesians, back to Ephesians By the way, this is a very informal broadcast, and there's going to be mistakes, and grab your cup of coffee. This is casual. It's not pre-scripted. It's just rough around the edges, and it is what it is. So, at any rate, let us go back to Ephesians, where Paul says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." And then he goes on and says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord." So, he's not going to contradict himself, because right after he says submit to one another, he talks about wives submit to your husband. And he goes on to say how children and parents should conduct themselves, and how slaves and masters should conduct themselves. So, if one were to take the line of thinking, and I've addressed this before. I'm trying to hurry up here. I've addressed this before, that if an egalitarian uses this line of logic to say submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, and then Paul goes into wives submit to your husbands, and then so an egalitarian is going to say, well, then that means that the wife should then submit to the husband. Well, if you go then further down the line here, where then Paul moves from the husband and wife to parents and children, where Paul says in 6:1, children, obey your parents. Well, if you use that same logic, then you'd say there needs to be mutual submission, that the children should obey their parents, but that the parents should also obey their children. So if you have a 7-year-old running around demanding that the parents submit to a 7-year-old who doesn't hardly know what's going on in the world, it's nonsensical. And then Paul goes on to slaves, and that's a fascinating topic, and I'd like to at some point get into that, because some would say, well, how is it that Paul embraces slavery? And Paul is not necessarily embracing the validity of slavery. What he's saying is in the context of the culture and the situation that they were living in, be holy. And some believe that Paul saw a very soon imminent return of Christ, and what he was trying to say is be holy where you are. And so if you're a slave, walk in nobility, as though you're walking and working and serving Christ himself. So in all our stations of life, we are to conduct ourselves in a noble and wise manner, and that's what Paul's talking about. So if we continue about slaves and masters, then one who's an egalitarian will then argue that, well, then slaves should have equal authority to their master, which is nonsensical in that setting. And I believe very much, though, that this would then reflect perhaps a modern day work environment where you would have a supervisor or a manager or a boss, for lack of a better word, and an employee, so that the employee should be subject to the authority at the workplace. But an egalitarian would say, oh, no, they're equal, so I can go into my supervisor and say, hey, I don't need to submit to you. You need to submit equally to me, and I'm just as got as much authority at the workplace as you. So that's what an egalitarian is going to argue also. So an egalitarian that uses this verse out of context, out of understanding of what Paul is addressing, is very unwise. And I like in one of Barclay's works, whether you like Barclay or not, I'm not saying he is gospel truth, but he's got a lot of good things to say, and he's addressing the whole issue of masters and slaves. By the way, he goes into talking quite a bit about marriage in the context of Paul addressing wives or submit to one another, and then wives submit to your husbands. Paul is addressing this in the context of a marital crisis time, at a time that at multiple levels. One was at the Jewish level, where a husband could say that he doesn't like his wife, or he doesn't like her cooking, and can come up with all kinds of reasons and just divorce her and go get another wife. So there was a lot of that going on, and then within the Greek culture, there was a breakdown and a lot of inappropriateness within marriage. And then the same way, early on in the Roman Empire, I believe there was very little divorce, but over time that changed. But even if there wasn't a divorce, there was a lot of mentality both within the Greek and the Roman cultures that there was importance with the wife, and that she was to run the home and be the mother of the children, but it was okay for the man to kind of get a lot of his pleasurable activities elsewhere, and then that was perfectly fine, and that happened extensively. So Paul is addressing the marriage as to the way it's supposed to be functioning in the sight of God, so that there is a restoration with marriage. And yes, there and if I could bring in this point that Barclay is saying about masters and slaves, and I think it's applicable here to what Paul is addressing when he says submit to one another. Paul says Paul has something to say to those who are in charge of others. So just as the husband has an authority, and we can also go on that note, go into the fact that men will say, yeah, I have the authority, and I've said this before, but then Paul goes on to extensively talk about how the husband is to love the wife and lay his life down for the wife. So before the man starts running around saying, yeah, I'm the boss, well, he should take a very close look at the fact that he is to love his wife as Christ loved the church, and the fact that he is accountable in the sight of God for his leadership. So, the man needs to slow down and understand what's going on in that context, so that he is not abusive in that role in any way. And Paul or Barclay addresses that. Let me come back again and say this again. Paul has something to say about those in charge of others, too. They must remember that although they are in charge, they are still servants of God. They too must remember that all that they do is done in the sight of God. Above all, they must remember that the day comes when they and those whom they are responsible for will stand before God, and then status in the world will no longer be relevant. So if I'm a husband and I have an authority over my wife, and then I go to heaven, and then my wife is there with me eventually in heaven, there isn't going to be that authority, but what's going to be left is my accountability as to how I handle that authority while on earth. So I am answerable to that. So this is a very, very important role. I'm going to wrap it up. I think I'm actually up to 12 minutes now, something like that. So be careful that verse is not taken out of context as it often is. And on my next episode, I will then go on to what at least I'm going to attempt it, is the third egalitarian objection that is brought forth. So until next time, take care.